The afternoon sun shimmered above the Philippine Sea, its light scattering off waves that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. At 20,000 feet, the air was thin, bright, and strangely quiet, until the first contrails appeared. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell eased the throttle of his F6F Hellcat forward, eyes fixed on a cluster of distant specks moving fast and low. They were coming straight toward his formation, 30 Japanese Zeros, in tight combat groups, banking hard, confident, and aggressive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. McCampbell's heart rate did not change. The pilot beside him, Ensign Roy Rushing, tightened his grip on the control stick. They were outnumbered 15-1, the kind of odds that once meant certain death in the Pacific skies. But this time was different. When McCampbell dived, the Hellcat did not shudder or stall as the old Wildcats once had. Its engine, a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, roared with almost casual power. As the first Zero crossed his gun sight, McCampbell fired a controlled burst. The 6 50-caliber machine guns tore through the sky, and the Japanese plane erupted into fire before it even began to turn. Another dove beneath him, McCampbell rolled inverted, pulled through a diving turn, and fired again. Within minutes, 9 Zeros were falling in flames. The Americans lost none. By the end of that single day, June 19th, 1944, the Hellcat squadrons of Task Force 58 would shoot down more than 300 Japanese aircraft. The pilots called it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. To the Japanese Navy, it was something else entirely. The day the Imperial Air Service died, how did it come to this? How did Japan's once invincible Zero, the aircraft that terrorized the Pacific for the first 2 years of the war, become helpless prey? The answer was not a miracle of design alone, nor mere numbers. It was a psychological collapse built on misunderstanding, and the story began 2 years earlier, when a single captured Zero revealed the truth about Japan's greatest weapon. By the middle of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy ruled the skies from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. American pilots who survived early encounters described the same nightmare. Zeros that turned tighter, climbed faster, and struck from impossible angles. The F4F Wildcat, sturdy but slow, could barely keep pace. Reports filtered back to Washington, describing entire squadrons wiped out before they could even fire a shot. Japanese pilots believed this superiority was permanent. Their training emphasized individual skill, instinctive combat, and spiritual purity. The Zero itself embodied the Bushido ideal: light, elegant, and deadly. Its designers at Mitsubishi had stripped away every unnecessary ounce of weight. No armor plate, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no redundancy. In the first months of the war, that gamble paid off. At low speeds and in tight turns, the Zero was unmatched. But beneath that triumph lay a fatal flaw. It depended on an illusion, the assumption that its enemies would always fight the same way. When Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders test flew the captured Zero at San Diego's North Island in September 1942, the illusion began to crumble. Sanders discovered that above 300 miles per hour, the Zero's controls stiffened dramatically. Its roll rate dropped, its elevators locked under pressure, and it bled energy faster than the heavier American designs. At higher speeds, the aircraft that once felt invincible became clumsy and fragile. That single realization changed everything. American engineers and tacticians rewrote their manuals overnight. The next generation of naval fighters, the Grumman F6F Hellcat, was designed around those weaknesses. It would be bigger, heavier, and far more forgiving to fly. Its cockpit armor weighed nearly 300 pounds alone, its self-sealing tanks added more, and its airframe could absorb punishment that would tear a Zero apart. On paper, it looked like an overbuilt brute. In practice, it became the most lethal fighter ever to launch from a carrier deck. When the first Hellcats reached the fleet in August 1943, pilots were skeptical. They called it the Iron Works Special, after Grumman's reputation for rugged, inelegant planes. But the Hellcat was more than a machine, it was a shift in philosophy. The United States no longer sought to match Japan's agility, it would exploit it. The Hellcat could dive at 400 miles per hour without structural failure. It could climb with astonishing steadiness and roll sharply at high speeds precisely where the Zero faltered. Its massive radial engine could take hits and keep turning. If one cylinder failed, another dozen still fired. Pilots learned to fight vertically, using altitude, speed, and firepower rather than turn radius. Japanese intelligence dismissed these reports. To them, the Zero's supremacy was a matter of spirit, not physics. The idea that a heavier, slower-looking American fighter could outperform their masterpiece seemed absurd. Their doctrine remained unchanged, even as losses began to mount. At Rabaul, in late 1943, the first Hellcat squadrons began regular combat patrols. Encounters that once ended with burning wildcats now ended differently. Commander Butch O'Hare, America's first Navy ace, described it bluntly: "We can take hits they can't, and we can dive where they dare not follow." Still, the Japanese pilots believed these were isolated flukes. Their leaders told them the new American fighter was a mere modification, nothing revolutionary. It would take another year, and the destruction of Japan's entire carrier air arm, before they would realize how wrong they were. In the months before the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japan rushed to rebuild its decimated air groups. The veterans of Midway and the Solomons were gone, shot down, or lost at sea. The replacements were barely trained, flying the same Zero design first built in 1939. Fuel shortages limited flight time. New pilots often had fewer than 100 hours before combat. In contrast, the United States was producing trained aviators faster than Japan could count its losses. By early 1944, the numbers alone were staggering. The U.S. Navy had fielded over 12,000 Hellcats. Japanese carrier forces, once elite, now relied on quantity over quality. Yet still, Tokyo's high command clung to the faith that the Zero's spiritual superiority would prevail. That faith would meet reality on June 19, 1944. The dawn of that day, what historians would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, broke over a vast formation of U.S. carriers and escort ships. Above them, hundreds of Hellcats waited. Their pilots were briefed on a single principle: never turn with a Zero. At 9:45 a.m., radar picked up the first incoming waves. Over the next 8 hours, Japanese pilots launched attack after attack. They flew bravely, many to their deaths, clinging to outdated tactics that had once brought victory. Hellcats intercepted them miles from the fleet. What followed was not a battle in the old sense, but a massacre shaped by physics and preparation. The Hellcat's superior speed, climb rate, and rugged design turned the skies into a slaughterhouse. Pilots who once feared Zeros now hunted them with methodical precision. By sunset, the kill ratio spoke for itself: more than 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of fewer than 30 American planes. In some squadrons, the ratio reached 19-1. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy realized its air power was gone, and with it, the myth of the Zero. The smoke over the Philippine Sea lingered long after the battle had ended. Hundreds of burning aircraft fell in trails of black across the horizon, so many that one American pilot later said the sky looked like a city on fire, only upside down. What had begun as a confident Japanese assault had turned into one of the most lopsided defeats in aviation history. But to understand how the Hellcat achieved a kill ratio so staggering 19-1, we must go beyond the numbers. It wasn't just the machine. It was a convergence of design philosophy, pilot training, and tactical evolution that the Japanese never anticipated. Grumman engineers had a saying: "If it looks right, it flies right." The Hellcat didn't. It was bulky, almost awkward, with wings that folded upward like an enormous seabird. To the untrained eye, it looked more like a flying tank than a dogfighter, yet that ungainly silhouette hid brilliance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Leroy Grumman and his team designed the F6F for one purpose: to win naval air superiority, not air shows. The cockpit sat high and clear, giving pilots a panoramic view of the ocean. Its landing gear was built to absorb the brutal shock of carrier landings. Its fuel tanks could self-seal after hits that would have ignited a Zero like a torch. Even its wings were designed for damage tolerance. A Hellcat could lose a section and still limp home. Every inch of it reflected a lesson written in blood from the early Pacific campaigns. When American test pilots studied the captured Zero, they learned that its astonishing maneuverability came at a steep price. Its light construction meant even a single bullet in the right place could be fatal. Its engine could not absorb punishment, and its airframe twisted at high speeds. So, Grumman went the opposite way. Thicker armour, more power, stronger wings. If the Zero was a rapier, the Hellcat was a sledgehammer, but a sledgehammer with finesse. Its Pratt & Whitney engine produced over 2,000 horsepower, nearly twice that of the early Zero. In a dive, the Hellcat could reach 420 miles per hour before the Japanese pilot's controls even responded. And when it came time to climb back into the fight, that same brute force could pull the aircraft vertically where the Zero stalled out. The Japanese thought the Americans had built a sluggish brute. In reality, they had built the perfect predator for the kind of war the Pacific had become. Technology alone doesn't win wars. By 1944, the United States Navy had perfected a training system that produced pilots faster, safer, and better prepared than any nation on Earth. The average American naval aviator entered combat with over 350 flight hours. Japanese rookies, by that same year, averaged barely 100. Many had never fired their guns in actual dogfight conditions before they took off from their carriers. The Japanese pilot corps that had once terrified the Pacific was gone, its veterans lost over Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and New Guinea. In their place stood hastily trained replacements, who were told that spirit could compensate for inexperience. But spirit couldn't counter physics. American pilots drilled endlessly in energy fighting, maintaining speed and altitude as life insurance. They learned not to turn with the enemy, not to chase a Zero in circles, but to dive, strike, and climb. They called it the boom and zoom. Every engagement followed a rhythm: spot the enemy, build speed, dive from above the sun, fire short controlled bursts, and use the Hellcat's power to climb away before the Zero could respond. In combat, this turned deadly efficient. Japanese formations that once shredded slow-moving wildcats now found themselves outmaneuvered before the first pass. One of those voices was Lieutenant Alexander Vratsiu, a young Indiana pilot flying off the USS Lexington. On the morning of the 19th of June, 1944, he spotted a formation of Judy dive bombers heading for the fleet. Vratsiu dove from 10,000 feet, fired a short burst, and watched his first target explode. Without slowing, he lined up another, then another. Within 8 minutes, he had shot down 6 enemy planes. When he returned to the carrier, his ammunition counters still showed nearly half full. He was calm as he climbed out of the cockpit. "I could have had a few more," he said simply. Across the task force, stories like Vratsiu's multiplied. Ensign Joe Mims of VF-15 shot down 5 Zeros in a single sortie. Commander McCampbell would later tally 34 kills, most in the Hellcat, making him America's top naval ace. Each pilot echoed the same astonishment. The aircraft didn't just perform, it forgave. Mistakes that would have been fatal in earlier planes became recoverable. "You could be sloppy in a Hellcat," one pilot joked, "and still come home." For a navy that prized reliability over flash, this was perfection. On the Japanese carriers Zuikaku, Shokaku, and Taiho, the mood was disbelief. Pilots who returned from sorties described enemy fighters that seemed impossible to outturn, outclimb, or outrun. Commander Tadashi Nakajima, one of Japan's veteran air leaders, wrote in his diary, "Our new pilots burn with courage, but they die so easily." The enemy's planes are iron walls in the sky. Many didn't even realize they were facing Hellcats. In after-action reports, Japanese intelligence sometimes listed them as improved Wildcats, or F4F type. The truth that an entirely new generation of American fighter had arrived took months to sink in. But by then, it was too late. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japan lost 480 carrier aircraft, nearly its entire trained force. So complete was the destruction that their carriers afterward sailed to battle nearly empty, using them as decoys while land-based aircraft tried to fill the void. The Empire had lost not just machines, but the centuries of naval tradition that had once made the Japanese fleet formidable. Historians often debate whether that figure 19-1 is literal or inflated by the fog of war. Post-war analyses confirm that even conservative counts remain extraordinary. Across all combat theatres, the F6F Hellcat achieved an official kill ratio of 19-1 against the Japanese. That number wasn't the product of myth. It reflected the totality of advantage engineering, tactics, and manpower. Survivability. The Hellcat could take hits and bring its pilot home. A damaged Hellcat often landed safely. A hit zero rarely did. Power and speed. At 2,000 horsepower, the F6F could outdive and outrun anything Japan had in the air. Visibility. Better cockpit view meant faster reaction times, often life or death in split-second dogfights. Training and coordination. U.S. Navy radar control directed squadrons to intercept enemies long before they reached the fleet, an edge the Japanese never developed. Psychological shift. American pilots entered battle confident in both their machine and their comrades. Japanese flyers entered it alone, burdened by expectations of death and honor. In the end, war isn't fought in spreadsheets of performance data, it's fought in human minds. The Hellcat broke the illusion of Japanese invincibility. After the Marianas, the Zero faded into legend. Japan would introduce new aircraft, the Ki-84, the N-1K-2 George. But they arrived too late, flown by men with too little fuel and too few hours. The war had moved beyond them. When Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa returned to Japan after the battle, he faced the bitter truth. The carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Hyo were gone, sunk by torpedoes or internal explosions. The air groups he had trained for years no longer existed. From that point onward, Japan's carrier fleet ceased to be an offensive weapon. Its ships became floating targets, its aircraft replaced by desperate kamikaze attacks. The Hellcat had not just defeated the Zero, it had outlasted the age of the Zero. As the sun set over the Pacific that summer of 1944, the ocean was littered with oil slicks, empty rafts, and the burning ghosts of Japan's air power. The American pilots flew back to their carriers, exhausted, silent, and stunned by the scale of what they had done. They had not set out to make history, but in the roar of their engines and the glint of their guns, a chapter of air warfare had ended forever. The Japanese had built their legend on speed, precision, and spirit. The Americans had answered with steel, science, and endurance. And in that meeting where the old ideals met modern reality, the Hellcat reigned supreme. The Pacific War was ending, but the echoes of that battle over the Philippine Sea would linger for generations. In the months that followed, Japan's pilots continued to fight outnumbered, undertrained, and increasingly desperate. The Hellcats still ruled the sky. For every Zero that managed to take off, there seemed to be 10 waiting for it in ambush. Yet what astonished historians later wasn't just the scale of destruction, it was how the nature of the air war itself had changed. When the Zero had first appeared in 1940, it embodied a philosophy speed through lightness, dominance through daring. Japan's designers had built it with the faith that courage could substitute for protection, that a plane and its pilot were one spirit. For a time, it worked. The Zero redefined air combat, but the Hellcat revealed that modern war obeyed colder laws. In the age of mass production, survivability meant victory. A nation that could lose planes and pilots and replace them faster than the enemy could adapt would eventually win. By late 1944, U.S. Navy pilots had given the Hellcat a nickname that summed it up perfectly. The Iron Cat. It could fly home riddled with holes, leaking oil, sometimes missing an entire landing gear, and still plant itself safely on the carrier deck. Ground crews joked that Hellcats didn't need pilots to land just a strong wind and a long enough runway. The aircraft's simplicity was its genius. The engine could be swapped in hours, the wings repaired with field tools, and its rugged structure allowed inexperienced pilots to survive their first mistakes. In war, that margin of forgiveness was priceless. To Japanese eyes, however, this was incomprehensible. They had trained for perfection, not survival. A Japanese pilot's first failure was often his last. When captured, Zero Ace Saburo Sakai was shown an F6F after the war, he was stunned. He traced a hand along its heavy armor and thick bulletproof glass and said quietly, "We could not have built this. We built airplanes to win the first battle. You built them to win the war." That, perhaps, was the truest epitaph of the Zero and the clearest tribute to the Hellcat. In 1945, as American forces advanced toward Okinawa, the Hellcat's dominance continued. Japanese airfields, once full of sleek fighters, now stood nearly empty. What aircraft remained were often used for kamikaze missions, pilots flying without return plans, their aircraft stripped of landing gear to save weight. For the men who had fought since 1942, it was a strange and hollow victory. Pilots like David McCampbell, America's leading Navy ace, no longer celebrated their kills. "It stopped feeling like combat," he later said. It was execution. The thrill of survival had faded into the quiet realization that they were witnessing the extinction of an era. When the war ended in August 1945, the Hellcat's mission was complete. Production lines shut down almost overnight. Grumman had built more than 12,000 of them, 12,000 ironclad symbols of industrial might and tactical evolution. And yet, within months, they were being parked, sold, or scrapped. A handful went to training units, a few to museums. The rest were left to the sun and rust, but their legacy would not corrode. After the war, both nations studied what had happened in those skies. The Japanese, now rebuilding under Allied supervision, found that many of their assumptions about aircraft design were obsolete. Lightweight construction, unarmored fuel tanks, and reliance on individual aces could not survive the industrial logic of total war. The Americans, too, learned. The Hellcat's success showed that the age of the lone dogfighter was over. Team coordination, radar interception, and pilot training had become more decisive than personal skill. Even in the jet age that followed the Panthers, Sabres, and Phantoms, the DNA of the Hellcat remained: survivability, reliability, and tactical discipline over glamour. For decades, historians compared the Hellcat and the Zero as symbols of two opposing civilizations, one ancient, one modern. But in truth, both were born from the same human impulse, the need to master the sky. The Zero was a samurai's blade, elegant but fragile. The Hellcat was a hammer forged in a factory. One fought for honor, the other for endurance. And yet, in their clash, neither side lacked courage. Japanese pilots flew into hopeless battles with the same calm resolve that American aviators felt as they dove through flak. Each man, on either side of that vast ocean, looked up at the same clouds and believed his cause was just. War simply decided which philosophy could outlast the other. There was a cruel irony buried in that 19-to-1 statistic. The Hellcat's success meant its pilots often faced less danger, less fear, but it also robbed them of what their predecessors had endured, the desperate seat of the pants fighting that had defined the early Pacific War. Victory came at the cost of experience. The very efficiency that saved lives also drained the romance from air combat. For many veterans, the war's end brought not joy, but silence. Years later, when McCampbell was asked what he thought of his 34 victories, he paused before answering, "Each one was a man who believed in his duty as much as I did in mine. I just had the better machine." Today, a few Hellcats still fly in museums and air shows, thick-bodied, blue-painted relics that roar with a deep, confident growl. Audiences watch them with admiration, but few realize that these aircraft once decided the fate of nations. When the propeller spins and that engine thunders to life, it carries with it not just the sound of power, but the echo of an era when the world was learning what modern war truly meant. Because in the end, the Hellcat was not only a fighter, it was a teacher. It taught the world that bravery without adaptability is suicide, that machines must serve men, not myths, and that progress, once unleashed, shows no mercy to tradition. The Japanese never expected the Hellcat to achieve 19-to-1 kill ratios. But in truth, that number was less about killing and more about understanding. It was the moment when war left the romantic age of dogfights and entered the cold, calculated dawn of modern air power. The Hellcat soared not because it was beautiful, but because it was honest, a machine built for survival, flown by men who learned from defeat and perfected by a nation that refused to repeat its mistakes. And somewhere above the Pacific, in the memory of that blazing June sky, the Iron Cat still flies. The war had ended. But for the men who had lived their lives through the sound of engines and tracer fire, peace arrived as a kind of deafness. The Pacific sky, once alive with roaring metal, had gone quiet, and in that silence the survivors began to remember. In hangars across the American West Coast, rows of Hellcats sat wingtip to wingtip under fading sunlight machines that had once been worth their weight in gold, now sold for scrap at a few $100s each. Some were melted into pots and pans. Others rusted in overgrown airfields, forgotten until decades later, when restorers would find their serial numbers and realize, this one fought at the Philippine Sea. Japan, meanwhile, was rebuilding from ashes. In Nagoya, where once the Nakajima and Mitsubishi factories had thundered with production, women swept the floors of bombed-out assembly lines. The same engineers who had shaped the Zero now turned to sewing machines, bicycles, and eventually cars. They had lost a war, but they would not lose their discipline. One of them, Jiro Horikoshi, the man who had designed the Zero, wrote quietly in his post-war memoir, "All I wanted was to make something beautiful and perfect. But beauty does not survive war." His words carried the quiet truth that every engineer of that age eventually learned. Technology is never neutral. It serves the hands that command it. For the Hellcat pilots, the transition to peace was uneasy. They had lived through the purest form of purpose, clear enemies, measurable victories, comrades who shared every risk. Civilian life, with its slow routines and quiet nights, felt strangely foreign. Many returned to small towns across America and built lives that looked nothing like the heroes the newspapers had once printed. They became teachers, farmers, and engineers. Some couldn't speak of the war at all. Others spoke only when asked, and even then, sparingly. The kill ratios, the medals, the photographs, all of it meant little compared to the faces of those who didn't come back. As one Navy pilot later said, "You don't count 19-to-1 when the one was your friend." In Japan, the pilots who survived the last battles carried a heavier silence. They returned to a country that had been burned, starved, and humbled. Their airfields were gone, their comrades too. And worst of all, the dream that had driven them to defend the Emperor's realm in the air had vanished. Some of the young men who would have become Zero pilots in 1946 or 1947 became bus drivers, mechanics, or university students instead. They studied English and read about the same machines that had destroyed their own squadrons. In the early years of the occupation, a few Japanese veterans were invited to inspect American aircraft up close. When they saw the Hellcat's armoured cockpit and thick radial engine, they understood instantly why they had lost. They hadn't been outflown, they had been outlasted. It was not the courage of the individual, but the endurance of the system that had won. The Hellcat's legacy reshaped more than just aircraft design. It redefined air power itself. Future generations of engineers realized that no single aircraft, no matter how agile or advanced, could carry a nation's hopes. It took logistics, training, and adaptation. From that philosophy would come the jets of the Cold War, the Sabre, the Phantom, and the Tomcat, each one heavier, faster, and more reliant on systems than any pilot alone could manage. The Hellcat had proved that progress was not about elegance, it was about survival multiplied by production. And yet, there was something almost tragic about that success. The Hellcat had been designed for a war that could never be fought again. Its greatest lesson was also its farewell message. The world had outgrown the romantic duel of the sky. In the late 1960s, a Japanese documentary filmmaker arranged a meeting between two veterans, one former Zero pilot, one former Hellcat ace. They shook hands on camera, two grey-haired men who had once tried to kill each other above the Pacific. When asked what he remembered most, the Japanese pilot smiled faintly. "I remember the noise, always the noise, then nothing." The American nodded. "I remember the quiet afterward." The interviewer asked them what they thought of the 19-to-1 kill ratio. Both men laughed softly, almost embarrassed. "It's not about numbers," the Japanese veteran said. "It's about who learned faster." History records victories in statistics. 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, 19-to-1, mission accomplished. But the true victory was something quieter, an evolution of understanding. When Japan and the United States rebuilt their post-war friendship, they did so not in spite of their aerial war, but because of what it had taught them. American aviation engineers later collaborated with Japanese firms, sharing the same technical obsession that had once made them enemies. By the 1970s, both nations were building aircraft not for conquest, but for exploration, spacecraft, satellites, passenger jets. The same genius that once crafted weapons of war was now building bridges across the sky. In that sense, the Hellcat's 19-to-1 ratio was not merely a triumph of combat, it was the painful tuition of progress. Humanity had learned at last that domination through technology alone leads only to exhaustion. On a summer morning in 2019, one of the few remaining F6F Hellcats took off from a restored airfield in Texas. Its wings shimmered in the sunlight, the same deep navy blue it had worn 75 years before. Below it, a crowd of veterans, historians, and families watched in reverent silence. The pilot, a man born decades after the war, guided the aircraft through a slow climbing turn and saluted. For a moment, it was 1944 again. The engine's roar rolled across the field, a sound older than memory but still capable of stirring something deep within anyone who heard it. When the Hellcat landed and the propeller slowed, the applause began not for victory, but for remembrance. Because the story of the Hellcat is not only about how it destroyed the Zero, it is about how the men who built it, flew it, and fought against it carried forward its lessons long after the war ended. The Japanese never expected the Hellcat to achieve 19-to-1. Neither did the Americans. What they discovered, in the end, was that the true measure of progress isn't how many enemies are defeated, but how much wisdom survives the fight. And so, when the last Hellcat finally lands and its shadow fades into history, it leaves behind not a machine of war, but a mirror, reflecting the best and worst of what humanity can build when it learns to adapt, to endure, and to rise again. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.